بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم أصحاب السمو والمعالي والسعادة، سيدات والسادة، نتشرف اليوم بالترحيب بضيف القمة رئيس الوزراء البريطاني السابق سيد جوردن براون، واسمحوا لي أن أتحول إلى اللغة الإنجليزية لتقديم ضيفنا الكريم، ويمكنكم الاستماع للترجمة الفورية من خلال الأجهزة المتوفرة. I welcome you again, Mr. Brown, in English this time. Gordon Brown served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leader of the Labour Party from 2007 till 2010. Previously, Mr. Brown served as Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1997 to 2007. And in July 2012, he was made Special Envoy for Global Education. He is a passionate advocate for global action to ensure education for all. He is married to Sarah Brown, a charity campaigner, and the couple have 2 young sons. And I believe the year 2025, Mr. Brown, means a lot in your campaign, as they will be 18 and 21. Mr. and Mrs. Brown are the founders of Their World, a charity which engages young people, business leaders, health and education professionals, and civil society to create a brighter future for every child. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gordon Brown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Your Royal Highness, distinguished guests, can I say first of all what a real pleasure it always is to be in Dubai and to be in the United Arab Emirates. And it's a particular pleasure always to be here because of the success of Dubai and the success of the United Arab Emirates. And I want immediately to pay tribute to Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum for his leadership here in Dubai and for the tremendous success he has achieved, which you have just seen in the tables and the statistics that has been presented before you. To have moved in literacy in this whole region from 18 to 82% over a short period of time, to have the United Arab Emirates at the top of every table for knowledge and for education and for learning, to have a vision of the future of this country, which is as an education and innovation centre and capital of the world, to not only be about to celebrate in 2021 the 50th anniversary of UAE by hosting the exhibition from all over the world, but to have such a vision of an educated and innovative country is a great tribute to the leadership here, and I want to acknowledge the great success that has been achieved that I can see as I travel the world is very distinguished and distinct here. You have said as a country that oil and gas are important for your present, but the real potential for the future is the potential of people. That what you are trying to do is to tap the enormous talent and the enormous ability and the enormous capacity of every young boy and every young girl. And I want to suggest today that you are not only on course to do this, but that we can learn from some of the great education reforms and innovations that are taking place around the world. And this will make you an even more successful innovation and knowledge capital of the future. But I want to say one other thing as I start my remarks. Education is about opportunity. It is about economic efficiency. It is about spurring innovation right across the economy. But education is also about hope. If a young person is in education, then they are able to plan for the future. If a young person is at school and getting qualifications, they're able to think about the life ahead of them and prepare for it. If there is no education, then for young people there is very little hope. And while food and shelter are essential to survival, and this is most important, when, as I will talk about in a few minutes, we deal with the challenges of the refugee population in the region, while food and shelter are essential to survival, it is education and the prospect of getting qualifications, planning for a career, that gives people the hope that is necessary for the future. One of my great friends, in the time I was Prime Minister and a Finance Minister, was Nelson Mandela. He was a great hero of mine, and I met him almost immediately after he came out of prison in the 1990s. And I hosted in London Nelson Mandela's 90th birthday celebrations, when he tried, because his interest was in the future of children, to raise money for a children's hospital and for a children's school in his country of South Africa. And he came to London for that purpose, to raise money for his foundation so that he could give young people hope for the future. And he auctioned a letter that he'd written, Nelson Mandela's Letter to a Child. And it's a famous letter because he spells out his hopes for the future. And the original copy of what he had written was auctioned at this 90th birthday celebration. And I and so many others were there. And there were famous people there. Bill Clinton was there, Forbes Whitaker, Oprah Winfrey, Elton John. So many people that you have heard of around the world were there. And this auction of the letter came down to only two people in the end able to bid. 900,000 Oprah Winfrey, 950,000 Elton John, 1 million Oprah Winfrey, 1.1 million Elton John, 1.2 million Oprah Winfrey. And then Elton John pulled out. And Oprah Winfrey was told that she was not paying in dollars as she expected, but paying in pounds, which cost her $500,000 more. And then Nelson Mandela went to the concert that was being held with all these pop singers from all over the world. And one of them there was the late, great Amy Winehouse that many of you may have heard of. And I went down with Nelson Mandela to meet the stars, the pop singers. And Amy Winehouse came up to Nelson Mandela and said, Mr. Mandela, she said, you and my husband have a great deal in common. And he said, I don't understand. What is it? And she said, yes, both of you have spent a great deal of time in prison. And this was Nelson Mandela at the concert celebrating his 90th birthday. And he told a story. In his prison cell, he had very few possessions when he was on Robben Island. And of the few possessions he managed to get into his prison cell was a painting, a facsimile of a painting, not the original, but a facsimile of that painting. And it was on his wall. And the painting was entitled Hope. And when you looked at the picture, first of all, you would think it was the opposite, desolation, because it was the picture of a young girl, blindfolded, standing on a globe of the world, trying to play a harp that had broken strings. Almost impossible. You'd think it was an example of desolation rather than hope. But the message Mandela said of that painting was clear to him. Even in the most hopeless situations, there must be hope. And even in the most hopeless situations, we can create hope. And when it comes to the refugee problem in this region where young people are without hope, we have got to give them that hope through making sure that they have education. It's said you can survive for 40 days without food. You can survive for 8 days without water. You can survive for 8 minutes without air. But you cannot survive for 1 second without hope. Education is about hope. And so what is the perspective? What is the trend in the world that we are dealing with? When I was chairman of the G20, the organization that tried to deal with the world recession in 2009, we did a survey and a study of what were the trends in the world economy and what did it mean for what we had to do for the future. Very similar to the work that your leaders are doing here about planning for your future. And we found that since 1980, we'd been going through what we called a manufacturing revolution, where the productive power of the world was shifting eastwards from the Old West to Asia. So for 200 years almost, America and Europe had more than 50% of the world's manufacturing and production and trade and investment in these goods and services. And now China, Asia, the Middle East, increasingly Latin America, and then Africa were starting to have a bigger share of the production that was being done in the world. And the second thing we found was a consumer revolution was about to take place. And round the world, instead of the consumer markets being dominated by America and by Europe, the rest of the world over the next 20 years was going to become more important for consumer spending than even America and Europe, which had dominated consumer spending for 150 years. And then we looked at the third trend, and that was a shift in the balance of income and wealth, partly because of oil and commodities. And again, the West, Europe and America, was going to lose its preeminence, but that would take over 30 or 40 years. And we saw that the biggest trend was the rise of the global middle class. That was 500 million people in 1980, 1 billion in 1990, 2 billion people in 2010, as we predicted, and now by 2025, 4 billion. And you know what we found most of all, however, about what was happening to the world economy? That the countries that were going to be successful, and the countries that were going to get the lion's share of the new consumer markets, as we doubled the number of the global middle class, and as consumer spending doubled in its size over 15 years, the biggest beneficiaries were not going to be the biggest countries. The biggest beneficiaries were going to be the countries that specialized in innovation, the countries that were prepared and were able to see new inventions coming into play, where their companies were innovative, adaptable, and flexible, where they were exploiting new technologies, particularly information technologies, to make the goods of the future. And one of my friends, Johnny Ive, who's the design head of Apple, gave me an example that I give to you today. If you look at an Apple iPad or an Apple iPhone, or if you look at all the Apple products, and then you think you're paying, let's say, $400 for one of the products, well, of course, there are many manufacturers making the components of that Apple iPad and the Apple iPod. There are many manufacturers in China and Asia and increasingly around the world, and then it is assembled as a product from the many manufacturing inputs. But the profit for the manufacturers of that $400 iPad is something in the order of $5 only. The profits that go to the innovators, those who have the ideas and have got the design and who've got the inventiveness to create a new product, that's about $80 for the Apple product of $400. So the future lies in the wealth that will be created from the inventors and the innovators, and not simply from the manufacturers. And those countries that can develop a technological base will be the countries that will do best in standards of living in the future. And the key, of course, to innovation is the success of education. If you go to China, as I do many times, you will find that they are trying to double the amount of research and development, assistants and researchers and innovators. They are spending a huge amount of money to move from a manufacturing economy of low value-added goods to being an innovative economy that springs the middle income trap and at the same time is the host of companies that are inventing new products and services and continuously upgrading and innovating. That's now not how China has always been seen. The Indian trade minister was a good friend of mine, and he had a lot of criticisms of China, as you know India often does, of the Chinese neighbors that they have. And he told the story that he'd gone to China, and he hadn't anticipated that the weather was going to be so cold, and he had to get a coat at short notice. So he went into an international shop in China, and he asked if he could buy a cashmere coat. And he looked at the coats, and he found one that he liked. And it was only $200, so he said, I'll buy that coat. And then he looked at the coat, and there was no label on it. There was no tag saying who was the maker. And he asked the shop assistant, why is there no label? Where is it? And the shop assistant said, well, what label do you want? We'll give you Armani, we'll give you Canali, we'll give you Dior, we'll give you Burberry. What label do you want? And it was his point that China at that point was not an innovation economy. It relied on intellectual property that came from other countries. Sometimes in these countries in Asia at that time it was innovation that was stolen property, and there was a huge issue about who controlled it. But China has realized that if it is going to be successful, it has too got to be an innovation economy. And as I say, innovation, as I have found going around the world, depends on education. There are three groups of people that an education system must cater for if a country is going to be successful. A basic education, as you are proving in this region, is an essential element for all. And no child should be excluded from education, because the potential of that child will never be known if we exclude them from the possibility of them making the most of their talents. And then we need a strong and educated graduate population who go through primary, secondary, and further and higher education to get graduate qualifications. These are the professional and business and managerial classes that we need. But then also, you need to encourage research and development experts, people who are researchers, innovators, people who can bring that talent to the development of your economy. And if you need these three groups of people coming out of your education system for your country to be successful, you need, as has been shown here, 4 things in your education system that are absolutely crucial to the success. And it is true of every successful country in the world that all these 4 characteristics come together. The first is teachers must be of the highest quality. We must never forget that education is communicated through the teacher herself or himself. And we must never forget that the quality of teachers is what is important to the success of the child. And we must not forget either that if we don't give teachers the status that is necessary, then they will not respond with the educational input that we need. My wife Sarah did a survey for a book for charity and asked people in all walks of life, who apart from your parents was the greatest influence on your life? And almost invariably everyone. Alec Ferguson, my friend, the manager of Manchester United at the time, did he say it was another footballer? Did he say it was a coach or a manager? No, he said it was his primary school teacher who had been the greatest influence on his life. And that is true of everyone, from scientists and inventors to pop singers and comedians. And you will find that it is the teacher that has the huge influence on a young child's life. And none of us ever forget the names of our teachers. The second thing is leadership through good head teachers. You cannot have a school that is successful without having a good head teacher, someone that can encourage and inspire and innovate and respond to change. And just as His Royal Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid has been at the leadership of innovation in this country, so too in every school we need an innovator who is a leader, who is prepared and willing to spend the time inspiring the young students in their class. But we need, thirdly, the right curriculum. And here it is exciting what is happening in this country, because you are bringing into the curriculum subjects that excite the imagination of young people, and we must do more of it in every country around the world. And the inspiration that comes from the space travel and the space program is something that will change the lives of a generation of young people in this country who can see the ambition to go into space reflected in the curriculum they now study in their schools. Coding, the great new advances in how we code our computers and code our information technology, translated into courses now in the schools here, and awards for people who do well as a result of that. And so a curriculum that is relevant to the needs of the future is something that we must never forget. And finally, the application of technology. You know, the opportunity that technology now gives us is immense. It is the opportunity that the poorest child in the remotest area of the world, even when everything else is against that child, could through mobile telephony access the best libraries in the world and access the best lecturers and lectures in university and access every knowledge platform, even from the remoteness of an area that is cut off in every other way except through mobile telephony. And it will change the role of our teachers. This is what innovation in education is going to do. Because of access to mobile learning and courses that are online, then you can think of the teacher as a lecturer in one instance, but the lecturer may come from any other part of the world, as a tutor who is coaching the child, as an examiner, of course, and as an advisor. And increasingly, we will see the role of the teacher in the classroom, not as the sage on the stage, as we call it, but as the guide by your side, the coach that uses the great knowledge available through information systems around the world, but is the advisor by the side of the child as you coach, tutor, and prepare them by individual, person-to-person, one-to-one encouragement to take their place in the world. So innovation in education is going to be the key to the future. If education is the key to innovation, then innovation is also the key to the future of education. Now, nowhere, and let me conclude on this before we have our question session, nowhere is this more relevant than in the area where I started my speech talking about the problems of refugees in this region. We have with us today here some people who are doing wonderful work. Her Royal Highness, who is doing a huge amount of work in raising money for cancer research in this region, and I praise her for her great efforts. And we have here also the Minister of Education in Lebanon, who almost single-handedly has brought 200,000 Syrian refugee children into the schools of Lebanon. And while facing other difficult decisions and choices and circumstances in a country that has its own problems, he has made it his business to say to each child who is a refugee child, I will do everything I can to make sure that you have a right to education even though you are a refugee. And I want to praise him for what he has achieved. And you know, we can do so much more. There are 2 million refugee children in this region simply as a result of what's happening in Syria. Many more as a result of Libya and as a result of Iraq and, of course, Palestinian refugees who need our support because of what has happened to them. And there are 6 million displaced Syrian children living in Syria or on its surrounding borders who are dispossessed and have been taken from their homes as a result of the war in that country. And our aim, and this is a UN aim that I reflect through Ban Ki-moon's comments today, I worked with him on this particular endeavour. Our aim over the next few months is to make sure that 1 million of these Syrian refugee children at least are in education during the course of next year. To move from the 200,000 figure in Lebanon to 1 million right across Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. To make sure that any refugee child has the chance to get the education they need and therefore has hope for the future. And we will want to use the innovations in technology and the learning courses that make it possible. We will want to train teachers, but there are many unemployed teachers as well who can do this job. And we will want this to be an international effort to prove that where there is distress and desolation and despair, we can actually bring hope to the communities and to the children who now are denied the possibility of planning for the future. When I was in Beirut a few weeks ago, I had the same experience that had been communicated to me by the Minister for Education, Elias Boussab, who's here today. I met a young boy, and as you do, you ask boys and girls when you meet them, what do you want to be? What do you want to do when you grow up? And this young boy came back immediately to me and he said, I want to be an engineer. And he was 12 years old and he wasn't at school and needed to be at school. He said, I want to be an engineer. And I said, why do you want to be an engineer of all the different subjects you could choose? He said, I want to be an engineer, he said, because I want to go home to rebuild Syria. And there was a young boy who had his own vision of the future. And there are 2 million children like that in this vicinity of Syria who need our help now. And so all the great expertise that is in this hall today, all the great advances in technology, all the great humanitarian thoughts that people have, let us not only apply that to make sure the education of every child in this country and in this region is assured for the future, because that is the future of this country, as His Royal Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid has said and has proved by the investment he is making in education. But let us prove we can give young people the chances and the opportunities, even in the situations that look hopeless. Let us make sure that by the end of this decade, every single child in the world, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of the circumstances they face, has that basic right that should have been established years ago, but we have the chance to be the generation to establish it. Every single child, the right to education. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can continue the Q&A here.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. It's very enlightening. And if I may put a journalist hat on and,
yes,
and ask you a few questions.
Please do.
And we will get back to the issue of Syria, which you are very, very passionate about and has done a lot of work on that. But can I ask you, in the beginning, what is your feeling about the results that you saw today with regards to the numbers that we have seen with 82% reading and writing in the Arab world?
Enormous advances. So, you know, you've done in 30 years what most countries took 100 years to do. So you've done in one generation already what took 3 or 4 generations in the countries in Europe and in America and in Latin America and, of course, increasingly in Asia. So you've made huge advances in a short period of time. But, of course, you want to move quickly to the next stage. So, as you saw, there are countries in North Africa, 38% literate. So that is a challenge that has got to be met immediately. But in countries where you're over 90%, like in this country, you want to move quickly to establishing a higher quality of education. So from literacy and numeracy, you want to have people who are coming out of your schools and colleges and universities with the computer and communications and all the modern skills that are needed for the future. There's a study done by the Wittgenstein Institute in Germany, and they look at different countries and what the prospects for higher education are. So even in 2050, some of the countries in Africa will still have only 5% of their young people in higher education. In this region, it could be 60, 70, and 80%, depending on the countries they choose. And then the challenge is to get employment opportunities in the private sector as well as in the public sector, and to encourage the entrepreneurial talents of young people here so that they can form the businesses based on innovation that will be the job creators of the future. So the next stage is beginning, and it's to move to the quality of education and to develop further and higher education. I think I'm right in saying you had 40 graduates only in this country at the time the country was created in 1971. 40. And now, of course, the vast majority of young people are in a position to get higher education.
Achievement indeed. Can I ask you on a personal level, as the UN Special Envoy for Education, it's a huge responsibility and a job. How do you go about making the world a better place when it comes to this?
Well, I took this job, which is a voluntary job, and I don't have staff other than those that I can find for myself. So it's a voluntary job to bring people together, because I saw the great advances made in global health. And we just talked about the great advances being made in cancer research. But across the world over the last 20 years, to the great credit of philanthropists, businesses, governments, we've seen global philanthropy at its highest level ever for global health projects: malaria, tuberculosis, AIDS, and the attack on diseases that are chronic as well as acute. And we've seen also the creation of the Global Fund for Health, which is a 13 billion fund that is being managed at the moment from Switzerland by Mark Dybel, who's a great organizer of it. And we've also seen governments committed to global health. So we've seen the American government invest a huge amount, and many other governments, including this one. But I felt global education was neglected. and not at the expense of health, but to complement health, we needed to do the same things for education. So we need global philanthropists, and we don't have them in the same way that we have Gates and others in education. We need a global fund to bring the funds together to deal immediately with a refugee crisis. Instead of having to wait for years while we raise the money, we ought to be able to move in immediately and provide the schools. Or if there's a natural disaster like an earthquake in Nepal, to be able to bring the resources immediately to get the schools back moving. So we need a global fund. And we need to get governments like this government and other governments to commit themselves that they will make global education a priority, so they will help countries that are way behind. You see, Nigeria's got 10 million children not at school. Pakistan's still got 7 million children not at school. And these are countries that are simply not investing enough in education, and they need the benefit of the expertise from here when you've done so much in other countries to do so. So my aim is, by the time I finish this job, to have a group of global philanthropists and businesses that are committed to education, to have a global fund of a sufficient size that it can intervene and take action when there's an emergency, and we're going to create a World Humanitarian Fund soon. And at the same time, I want to see the governments around the world not only committed to the education of their own children, but committed to using the expertise they bring up to help children in countries where the emphasis has not been the same priority that ought to be given to education. So that's why I took this job.
But in reality, the aid for education, in comparison with other types of aid, is a very, very small percentage.
Yes, yes.
Why is that? Who decides that kind of division?
There's two reasons. Because governments, when they give international aid, have their own priorities. Sometimes it's infrastructure, sometimes it's health, sometimes it's environmental sustainability. And governments have not prioritized aid for education when they've been giving aid to countries, and that's got to change. The second thing is the international institutions, because while there's a global fund for health, the World Bank, I believe, could do more on education. And of course, UNDP is doing a great job, and we saw that today. UNICEF is doing a great job. We have UNESCO on science and culture, and we have the Global Partnership for Education. They're all doing a great job, but we need better coordination. If we're going to get the money into education in the way it is needed, we've got to do it in a cost-effective way. Sometimes, if you go to a country like Tanzania or Malawi, there are 20 different aid agencies. We need to coordinate it better, and we're trying to do that for the future. As far as humanitarian aid is concerned, there is a structural reason why it's difficult to get money into education. So humanitarian funds, only 2% at the moment are going to education, and that's really for a good reason, and we've got to do something about it. That food and shelter are clearly the first priorities. Survival is of the essence. So that's why most of the humanitarian aid goes to food and to shelter and sometimes healthcare. So we've got to create another window for support for education. So give money to food and shelter, but also see the importance of education. Now, in this region, the importance of education is such that if we do not get these millions of children off the streets, then they're not only losing out on the opportunities they should have, and it is going to diminish the prospects of the economies of these countries. It is also, of course, a recruiting ground for terrorists and extremists.
I'd like to get into a little bit more in detail with regards to Syria and the refugees.
Yeah.
But if you don't mind, we just have a very short video that we'd like to show. That we've done some interviews with some of the children on the borders.
هدمت السورية كلياتها، قام جينا قام تعلمنا هناك شوي وجينا.
أحب بس أكبر صير دكتور وداوي المرضى.
أتعلم وأكبر وأصير دكتور. امبارح الصاروخ ضرب اعجاج وبسجه جنب المخيمات وجينا لهون نشتغل نعيش اخواتنا. ما بدي اروح المدرسة، بدي اضل تعيش اهلي، بدنا نشتغل نشيل سنتي 10 15 حسب.
اشتغل ساندويش ايش بكان شراتي، يعني لازمنا اغراض، لازمنا لبس، لازمنا كل شيء. أغراض شتوية البرد زي كنا يعني.
إيش ما الله رزقني.
جيت من سوريا وقت الأحداث، بشتغل ميكانيكي صار لي 4 سنين، وباخذ 30 ليرة بالكراج، ما بروح على المدرسة ومصاريفها كثير. بروحش على المدرسة، بشتغل دهان موبيليا عشان أصرف أخواني، والحياة هنا صعبة، وإن شاء الله بس أكبر بفتح محل وبصير معلم.
بدهم مواصلات وكتب ودفاتر، وبدهم كمان اللباس ومصروف بدنا كمان على المدرسة، يعني والمدرسة بعيدة، يعني ما فينا نروح مشان هيك.
والله مو اكو، يعني رحنا على المدرسة هاي الأشبال ما استقبلونا، يقول جيتوا بتأخير. احنا جينا من بغداد، جينا مشي وصلنا بغداد، وعفل المدرسة ماكو مدرسة وما عندنا شيء، عشان سنة ونص ترك المدرسة، واريد ارجع الديار حتى اداوم هناك. قوة طلعنا، هاي صار هنا قاعدين مدرسة ماكو، معلمين ماكو، ما حد يعلمنا، وهاي قاعدين ساكتين. اضطريت انا اشتغل، اذا الله كاتب لي الرزق اشتغل، ثم اشتغلت نضل قاعدين ساكتين.
Very good film.
Is this the largest challenge we're facing in the region at the moment?
I think for the long term, if we fail this young generation of refugees and don't give them the chance that they need to get educated when we could perfectly easily do so, then we will pay a very heavy price. We will have a lost generation, but it will be a loss not just in terms of their personal well-being and the economic success of the countries in future, but it will be a loss because you will have discontented, angry young people who see through their mobile phones, if they have them, that other young people in other parts of the world are getting chances that they are being denied. So we must do something about it. I mean, this was a very powerful film that I hope will be shown widely, and I congratulate your television channel on doing this, but it did show that young people are being forced into child labour. If their fathers or mothers cannot work, then they are part of an underground or illegal economy where they're getting very small sums of money to work when they should actually be at school. And what we must now do is open up some of the existing schools and put them on double shifts in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. But at the same time, where there are camps, of course, we've got to have prefabricated buildings that we can. The other thing that was clear from that film, by the way, is that young people are ambitious. Someone wanted to be a doctor and they want to be engineer. Whenever I go to school, you see the ambitions, engineers and airline pilots and everything. Nobody ever wants to be a politician, by the way. And I went on a school visit with Bono, the pop singer, once, and he was shocked because not only did no one want to be a politician in the classroom we were in, but nobody wanted to be a pop singer either. But young people are really ambitious.
What about the private sector? What's the role of the private sector and that kind of different view that they might bring into the equation to improve such of these situations?
Absolutely. We've formed in the region the Global Business Coalition for Education for the Middle East and North Africa. And we had a meeting yesterday in Dubai when a number of very important businesses in this region came together. They agreed that they would raise a large sum of money for the refugee education, but they also agreed that their technology and their expertise would be put at the service of both the governments and the NGOs that are trying to deliver education. So this cannot be done by politics or governments alone. In fact, we need the partnership of philanthropic organizations, and I was grateful that the head, Jamal, the head of the foundation, came to our meeting yesterday, because let me also congratulate the foundation on the amazing work that it does, and it is also playing a huge part in helping in this refugee crisis. So let me, and I think all of us want to congratulate the foundation.
Thank you very much. If I could just go back to the issue of the refugee and the refugee camps and the education there. In terms of curriculum, who decides the curriculum for all these children in these different borders, and how is the best way to manage this?
Well, there are two difficulties, aren't there? One is language, obviously, because Arabic is probably the most commonly use the language amongst the refugees. In Lebanon, for example, the teaching is in English and French and everything else. And secondly, the curriculum itself. And now, there has been a huge advance made, and I met yesterday the man who has been responsible for it. In the Lebanese schools at the age of 9, there is now a curriculum that shows the importance of religious diversity. It's not asking people to challenge their own religious views at all. It's saying there is a diversity of religious experiences and denominations, and we've got to recognize the value of each one of them. And because the extremist message is there is no possibility of coexistence, if you have a curriculum that is reflecting the diversity of religious denominations across the region, that can make a difference too. So it's very important that the young people don't fall into the hands of extremist teachers who are preaching violent messages. And therefore, the curriculum is an important issue. But this advance that has been made in Lebanon is now being discussed as a curriculum for Iraq. So we do see big advances here also. Mm.
If I may ask you, it might be a slightly controversial question. I'm not really sure, but we'll find out. With education and curriculum, even in some of the Western countries, like the UK, for example, a lot of these characters that we've seen on social media and operating freely in Syria, for example, and ISIS recruits and the way they recruit some of these children, is there something to say about the curriculum and the involvement of these children in European countries as well?
Yes, and we've got to be very careful about how the social media in particular is, because of the freedom of communication that exists, we've got to be careful it is not transmitting these extremist messages and allowing people to infiltrate even sort of ordinary and what look like harmless pastimes, like people on Twitter talking about football or about games that they play on computers. Suddenly this extremist propaganda is thrust by people who are determined to force young people into this choice. Mm-hmm. You've got to choose between whether you're on the side of ISIS or whether you're against them. And if you're against them, you're completely against everything that might stand for the religion itself, and that's how they present it. So, yes, the curriculum in the schools is an issue, but social media is an even bigger issue, and how much infiltration there is into it. You can close down websites, but in the end, you've got to try to get an alternative message across. You've got to preach that there is alternatives to violence.
But what is the atmosphere? What is the environment? What is the catalyst to recruit a lot of these young men that are most of them are at school age as well?
I've looked at all these studies of why young people in Britain or France or Belgium are being recruited to ISIL. ISIL presents this image that they are the brotherhood, and so you're part of a community of believers. And it's not the violence so much as this idea that attracts young people, but all the research shows that the experience that they have is quite the opposite of what they expect. Mm-hmm. It is a violent set of conflicts, inter-Sunni conflict and violence, and it's authoritarian and hierarchical, and young people desert. They try to get out. So we've got to show the real truth about what's happening in these cities.
If I can go back to the UN and the role of the UN,
yes,
especially when it comes to sending some very particular messages in terms of education and in conflict zones, do you believe that the UN is doing enough in terms of being able to send these messages and accountability for? One thing that comes to mind is a number of schools, for example, in some of these conflict zones that are targeted and specifically getting children out of school.
Well, nobody can say that any international organization is doing enough. Given the scale of the problem we face, we can never say we're doing enough. You see, if you look across this region, there are 200 million or so young people under 25. In some of the countries, unemployment or underemployment is above 50%. UNICEF and UNESCO and all these organizations, UNDP that is doing so much, and we saw this here, they can never have enough resources to be able to deal with the problems of undereducation, unemployment, and of course all the psychological and social and medical problems that arise from that. So we are certainly not doing enough. But the most important thing for me is that these agencies of the United Nations show that they can bring humanitarian support. I mean, if we can show that we care and that we can do something about the problems that people face, then people will see another view of America, Britain, or Europe, another view of this country as against other countries as well. And it's important, I think, we show by our actions that we are prepared to put sufficient resources in to providing food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And that's why I think we've got to do more, particularly in education, which has been the neglected area for young people.
In terms of Syrian children, again,
Yep.
and the age that they are supposed to be at school, are we usually these conflicts, the effect of it goes on for a very, very long time. And I believe with such conflicts, the average is, a camp life is of about 15 to 17 years in some cases.
The average age, the average time that a refugee will spend outside his or her country is over 10 years. So it is possible that a young person leaving Syria at the age of 4 or 5 will never be in a school and will get to 16 or 15 and never have been through the door of a classroom. And that is something that we should not be contemplating in the modern world. And so what looks like emergency help, so this could be for a month or two, we think, it's actually 10 years. Mm-hmm. And so you've got to build the structures that enable you to provide education, not just for a few days or a few months, but for many, many, many years. And that's why we will have to bring in prefabricated buildings into the camps. But that's why also, if the refugees, as in Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, are also dispersed around the country, we can get them into the existing schools. And the innovation in Lebanon, and the minister is here and he can explain it to others later, is the double shift school. So in the morning and early afternoon, the Lebanese children are being taught. And in the afternoon and right to the evening, the Syrian children are being taught. So you're using the same school, and there's a coexistence, and it is not therefore costing you a huge amount. You can educate a child for $500 per year, whereas if you had to build a new school, of course, it would cost considerably more. So this is not only a necessary thing to do, it's a cost-effective thing to do. And we've been presented with this opportunity because of the dispersal of refugees. They're not all in camps, that we can use existing schools to give them the chance to get an education.
So is that a model that can be replicated
yes,
in Jordan and in Turkey?
In Jordan there are, and I was hearing today of the success of double shift schools. And in Turkey they are trying to move now to create 250,000 extra places. And one of the ways, I think half of the places would come in double shift schools. Mm-hmm. So double shift schools are a good example of using existing facilities to best effect. The interesting thing about the provision of help for refugees in the region is that there is not a shortage of buildings, therefore, at the moment. There could be in time, but not now. There is not also a shortage of teachers, because there's a large number of unemployed teachers, but there's also Syrian refugees who are teachers themselves. The shortage is money. Mm-hmm. We could move the minister here could move from 200,000 to 300,000 if he had the allocation of money that was necessary to do so. And that's a challenge to all of us. And I would say we have to raise about $250 million a year extra, which is not a huge sum in global terms. And that should be shared between Europe, America, and the region itself. And if about 80 million a year was raised from within this region, 80 million in America, 80 million in Europe, then I believe we could provide for most of the refugee children that we have promised to allocate places to.
But if we're talking about an average of 10 years,
yes,
2 million children,
yeah,
that is a very scary number if you just take out all the other scary numbers.
It is, but they would have to be educated somewhere. And if they were back in their home country, it would still cost money. And we've got to prepare for the day that they can go back into their own country. And we've got to not forget, as the head of the foundation was reminding us yesterday, there are 6 million displaced children within Syria. And if we could get an agreement between the warring parties that education, as you say, education schools should be like hospitals and like religious institutions, they should be protected from being used as instruments of war. And if we could get an agreement that the schools could keep running, instead of being used as battering rams in the war, then we could still educate many of the displaced children within Syria as well. And we can use new technology to do so, because we could get to young people through a mobile phone or through a tablet, and there are cheap tablets now that can carry a curriculum direct to young people, and that's now a possibility that we're exploring.
That was actually going to be my next question in terms of innovation, and you keep talking about innovation, and everybody's main drive is innovation. What are innovative ideas that can be brought into this?
You know, someone said a few months ago, and I was reading it, that the classroom is about the last place in the world that has been subject to the technological revolution. That, you know, everything else has changed fundamentally, but we still hold to this traditional view of a classroom. And yes, there's new technology being brought into it, but the classroom is perhaps in need of huge innovative thinking about how it's going to develop in the future. Now, one of the things I talked about is the role of the teacher, because you don't need the teacher always to be the lecturer, the speaker. You can use video, you can use interactive communications with people who are skilled in teaching around the world and not just in your own country. But you do need to have the teacher as the tutor. Mm-hmm. And the concentration on the teacher becoming a better tutor with one-to-one advice for the pupil is where I think new technology takes us. But equally, online courses, Harvard University, Princeton, Stanford, all these courses are coming out of some of the best universities of the world, and they can be applied in a classroom here if we decided to use that technology to best effect. So there are huge advances now, of course, because in the next 10 or 15 years, we'll not only see advances in the way we teach, advances in the way we communicate information. So at the moment, we have now got great advances in things like Siri, where you can speak and you can then immediately have it printed out as text. In the next 10 years, there's going to be even bigger advances by using brainwaves, without you having to speak it, to communicate your thoughts that can then become text. Now, that opens up a whole range of possibilities for education. Some of them frightening, by the way, about the way that you could influence the brain, but some of them of great opportunity for the speed at which people can learn and the aptitude that people can show for different forms of learning. So the languages, for example, there's huge advances possible.
One of the things that the study touched on as well was the gap in technology. And is there a relationship between the numbers of lack of schools and the number of children who are not in education with the gap of technology? Is there a correlation between?
There is, as I think everybody here knows, a digital divide. That is those people who have the best schools and who have the best opportunities to learn with the best teachers usually also have the best technology. But the great thing about technology is the cost of additional the spreading of technology, the spreading of books, for example. If you're on a Kindle or an Apple or whatever it is, there's a nil extra cost in getting that book to the next person. Mm-hmm. And so it is potentially able, if we reorganize the way we did the curriculum, it's potentially able to get millions of children the books and the courses at nil cost. And that's what technology opens up.
Are you optimistic about the future of education in this region and beyond?
I'm always optimistic. I mean, you know, when you go into even some of the most desolate camps and settings in the world, there's always a young child who's got ambition and an aspiration to do something different. There's always a mother that is pushing ahead and demanding better standards for all the camp. I went to South Sudan, just to give another example, a few months ago, because they have a civil war and they need also to rebuild their education system. And I went to one school, and it was a one-hut school, and it was situated in a village outside Juba, the capital. And what was amazing to me was that there were 30 kids only they could educate in this one-hut school. But there was a portal, and looking through the portal, there were about 100 kids outside, desperate to have the chance of education. Now, there were mothers who had twin children having to choose only one of the twins getting the chance of education. There were mothers down the road I talked to who needed food and shelter, but the most important thing to them was that the kids had education. But the demand for education for those who do not have it makes you realize that we can do something about it, because there is the aspiration to learn, there is the ambition to make the most of your potential. And if sometimes we're too complacent in countries that are richer and some countries that are more comfortable, you only need to listen to children in the developing world in situations of difficulty and their demand, as you saw in the film. I want education. I may have to go out and make money at the moment for my family, but education is what I want to build for a better future. And that must make you optimistic about the future.
Well, Mr. Gordon Brown, thank you very much for your
Well, thank you all.
We
Thank
can
you.
go on for a long, long time. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you all.